This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon, everyone. May I have your attention, please? Wow, thank you. I am so glad to see everyone this afternoon and to mark another event in the calendar of the Emeritus College. And we like to talk about this as our inside picnic. So here we are on a beautiful spring day, gathered to enjoy each other's company and to have a picnic and listen to the remarks of our guest speaker. I was starting with a more formal introduction, and I was going to Professor Paul, Mrs. Sheth, and friends of the Emeritus College. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this is the 8th annual Sheth Distinguished Lecture on Creativity in Later Life. The Sheth Lecture is particularly meaningful, I think, this year because it continues the theme of the recent Emory conference, Creativity Through the Life Cycle. As many of you will know, the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence, also a part of the Office of the Senior Provost for Academic Affairs, was one of the co-sponsors of that most engaging conference. The creativity of our distinguished guest speaker today was showcased during that conference, thinking particularly of April 17th, with the performance of his musical Jubilee Gym. But we will perhaps hear more about that later. The Sheth Lecture is made possible by a very generous gift from Madhuri and Jagdish Sheth, both of whom are much loved members of the Emory community. Madhu Sheth is with us today, and I will ask her to stand so that we may show her our appreciation. Madhu, thank you for providing us this opportunity to gather, to enjoy each other's company, and benefit from the words of thought-provoking speakers. And please give our regards to Jag when he returns.
He's on May 2nd.
He's in India now?
He's in India right now. He's returning on May 2nd.
May 2nd. We'll give him our very best regards and thanks. Many people have contributed to the success of this day, and I will name those whose contributions have been so important and ask you to hold your applause until the end. I extend my sincere thanks to the Emory Alumni Association for their co-sponsorship and for making it possible for us to meet in this lovely venue. Leslie Wingate and Martha Fagan have been particularly helpful. Thank you both very, very much. The Teaching and Lecturing Committee of the Emeritus College, this committee has only been in existence a few months, jumped into action to advise and guide the process that has brought us here today. My thanks to the chair, John Gunmen, Betty Connell, Ron Johnson, Ron Frank, K.V. Thriva-Kramen, and Gretchen Schultz, all of whom participated in this event. As always, we have the behind-the-scenes crew, busily at work, and I want to thank, we have two program coordinators to thank today, Charity Crabtree and Isha Edwards. And joining them at the registration table is Joanne Dalton. So my thanks to all of you who have been named. To our retired faculty and friends, it's a pleasure to see you today. And I take this opportunity to extend the invitation for you to visit the new home of the Emeritus College, your Emeritus College. And if you look at your little program with Bobby Paul on the front and on the back is the home of the Emeritus College now in the Luce Center, a neighbor. We're in our own neighborhood here. The Luce Center is directly behind the Miller Ward House. come see us, all of you, and be an active participant and an active member. We welcome everyone. It is now with pleasure that I will turn over the program to our chair of the Teaching and Lecturing Committee, John Gunmen. John is professor of Emeritus of Social Ethics and also on the executive committee of the Emeritus College, so a busy person. John?
Thank you, Nan. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's an honor and a great personal privilege to introduce our 2011 Sheth Lecture on Creativity in Later Life. For most of you in this room, Professor Robert Paul, known almost universally at Emory as Bobby Paul, needs little introduction, given the many important roles he has played and offices he has held during his almost 35 years at Emory. Most of these are noted in the brochures that went out for the lecture, and there's no need to repeat them here. For any skeptics, I can simply assure you that he had the requisite academic preparation to be on the faculty here. For this occasion, though, I begin with a question. What do the following have in common? Tibetan and Himalayan culture and religion, the Atlanta Opera and the New York Metropolitan Opera, ritual and myth, psychoanalysis, early 20th century immigrants and the labor movement in New York City, Kurt Weill's Threepenny Opera, comparative Buddhism, a personal art collection, including especially Asian art and artifacts, the writing of plays and musicals, a love for Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov, an award for creative teaching, the founding of institutions of learning and creativity, an award-winning book. Any guesses? The answer is that every one, and heaven knows I've probably missed many, belongs on Professor Paul's list of interests and achievements. And the cross-fertilization among them make him one of the most creative members of the Emory faculty, enriching our academic lives at every level. I can think of no one more qualified to speak to the theme of creativity in later life. Just a few specifics. Trained in cultural anthropology with special interest in cultural myths and religion of Tibet, Nepal, the Himalayas, and South and Central Asia. Professor Paul's restless mind led him early to pursue study in other fields and to think broadly about the human imagination, creativity, and the human drama. In 1987, he began clinical training in psychoanalysis, becoming certified as a psychoanalyst in 1997 and continuing a practice to this day. Almost immediately, he founded Emory's highly regarded psychoanalytic studies program. That institute was also one of the primary sponsors for the conference on creativity to the life cycle that Nan just mentioned. His early courses on psychology were not merely on seminal figures in the field, but, for example, on Jung and the mythic imagination. His students have praised his creative teaching and his capacity for drawing on their imaginations in the interpretation of texts and of human culture. Such teaching won him the Crystal Apple Award in 2000. His imaginative explorations of symbols, myths, and meaning has also been articulated in stunning scholarship, including his book, Moses and Civilization, The Meaning Behind Freud's Myth, published in 1995 by Yale, receiving 3 distinguished national awards, including the National Jewish Book Award. These few highlights give some indication of the extraordinary contributions Professor Paul has made to the role of art and creativity in Emory's academic life. But there's so much more. Professor Paul writes plays and musicals. He has written, I understand now, 5 musicals. The one just produced in a reading at the Creativity Conference, and he writes the music for them. One of the musicals, The Rise of David Levinsky, played in New York in the 1980s, I think at the 92nd Street Y, is that correct? Based on a book by Abraham Cohen, the musical gives expression to Jewish immigrant life in New York at the beginning of the 20th century, one of Bobby's many interests and passions. The play was recently revived in Florida, enabling Bobby to take his son to see it for the first time. He and his wife Leslie are avid opera fans, and Bobby has a special love for Russian opera. He's a collector of Tibetan and Asian art and artifacts, in keeping with his view that living a life surrounded by art in every sense and the notion of applying aesthetic ideals to all aspects of your life is the way life should be. Vice President Rosemary Mcgee, who wishes very much she could be here today, having been Professor Paul's student and then having collaborated with him for many years, speaks of, and I quote, a veritable symphony of synchronicities, a kind of poetry in motion, and many dances of possibilities, all speaking to Bobby's commitment to the arts as a special way of knowing and being in the world. One last word. There is a story that at a gathering of the ILA faculty, Bobby picked up the karaoke mic and broke into a splendid rendition in German of Mac the Knife, Mackie Messer. I don't know whether we will be treated to anything from Kurt Weill today. I think the mic is not made for it, but I do know we are in for a treat. Join me in welcoming Professor Robert Paul.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks, John and Nan, for inviting me to do this. I'm very honored to do it. You've heard of all kinds of various things I've dabbled in my life, but of course my most recent experience was being dean of the college for 9 years, a post from which I just stepped down last summer. And when I was given the topic of this conference, this lecture, and also the conference, creativity throughout the life cycle, creativity in later life, it was a very creative suggestion. I thought in all kinds of directions, but in the end I kept coming back to wanting to talk about some observations that I wanted to give voice to now that I'm no longer the dean, but that arise from my experiences in academic administration. So I won't be talking about Mac the Knife or about Tibet or about the arts really at all, about or Russian operas. But I'm going to talk about the academic, the career trajectory of an academic and some of the threats and some of the challenges that it faces. So let me begin. It is certainly a great honor and privilege to be asked to deliver the annual Sheth Lecture. And of course, I want to begin by expressing my deep appreciation to the Sheth family, to Madhu and Jag, whom I regret that Jag is not able to be here, for their manifold, generous, and far-seeing contributions to the intellectual life of Emory University. Our community is very much in their debt for the efforts they have made over the years to encourage lively forums for the best of scholarly exchange. The mandate for the Sheth Lecture at the Emeritus College is the broad topic of creativity in later life, and I am inspired by this theme to use the occasion to reflect back on my years as an academic administrator at Emory, where I have served in such capacities as a department chair, chair of the college tenure and promotion committee, dean of the graduate school, and from 2001 through 2010 as dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. The general subject on which I wish to speak is that of the academic career trajectory and some of the issues that attend both those who choose to live it and those who, as administrators, manage and oversee it for those who have chosen it. More specifically, on the wise principle, write what you know, I will be speaking mainly about the career trajectory of tenure-track professors in the arts and sciences, but I believe much of what I have to say may also concern other members of the university community as well. The life of a professor at a great research university such as Emory is, it seems to me, intrinsically creative. First, insofar as the successful tenure-track professor is required to produce original research, which in turn can be defined as the production of new knowledge, any minimal criterion of creativity is already met. Equally importantly, teaching, too, is the supremely creative act of contributing to the intellectual and, often enough, the emotional or ethical formation of a new generation of unique individuals whose very being in the world is shaped as much by those who teach them in school, college, and graduate school as by anyone except perhaps their parents and their immediate family. Finally, a truth I did not quite believe when I first heard it from my friend and colleague, Rosemary Mcgee, one of the ablest administrators I've ever known, but came to realize in my own experience, academic administration, too, involves almost nothing other than an endless series of problems, puzzles, and conflicts, the resolution of which is necessarily always a creative one. Of course, it is possible to do each of these things in ways that are only minimally creative or not at all. One can create something that looks like research through the rehashing or recycling of old ideas, one's own or those of one's predecessors. One can be repetitive, boring, and unengaging in one's teaching so that one's positive effect on one's students is minimal. And certainly an administrator can be a bureaucratic hack or a rigid enforcer of shop-worn rules and procedures straight from a handbook. I must say, however, that in my experience at Emory, reviewing the files of candidates for promotion and tenure, for example, both as a faculty member on the Tenure and Promotion Committee and then again as dean, this depressing portrait is very much the exception and not the rule. This is because, in my experience, both the self-selection of professors as those who by temperament actually enjoy and thrive upon good research and teaching, and sometimes even good administration, as well as the rigorous selection process that winnows the field, beginning in graduate school and continuing through the competitive demands of getting hired, being evaluated and promoted after a probationary period to a tenured position. All these ensure that most professors are actually very good at what they do and would like to be able to keep doing it. So I have now established that the academic career trajectory, and this of course goes not just for those in the arts and sciences, is potentially, ideally, and often enough, in fact, a very creative life. The next question suggested by the theme of the Sheth lecture, though, is how long can one keep this up? Will promising and eager new assistant professors, excited about their research and energized by their new teaching duties, sustain this enthusiasm so that 35 years or so later they will still be doing their jobs creatively instead of through dry habit, rote repetition, or lifeless routine? Oh, I guess there's your answer. There are opposing views on this score. To some observers of the academic scene, it is the seasoned full professors who, having spent a lifetime with their field of study and their own thoughts, can produce the most powerful and authoritative research and can teach with the deepest and broadest comprehension of the field. On the other hand, one can also argue that those same seasoned professors, perhaps overly seasoned, have undergone their training decades earlier in graduate school, are far from the cutting edges of new developments in the field, and are still trying to solve problems that engaged the field when they were graduate students, but have long since been transcended by new discoveries, new theories and methods, or by the intellectual fashions and fads of the times. The professor in the classroom reading from dog-eared, dusty yellow notes scrawled years earlier is, of course, a commonly invoked image, if a caricatured one. But I would ask, does the fact that the pages are dry mean that the professor is as well? She may be repeating herself, but the students hearing the material for the first time may nonetheless experience a revelation. In short, however, the question remains, do professors age like fine wine, or do they gradually lose steam and exhaust the vitality that imbued their early work with the creative spirit? Perhaps the most interesting contribution to the understanding of the process of creativity in later life that I have encountered is to be found in the book Old Masters and Young Geniuses by the University of Chicago professor of economics, David Galenson, published in 2007. I hope some of you may have read it. If not, I highly recommend it. Galenson focuses on artists to develop his theory, but he also indicates that his findings, and he shows, may apply to scientists and other scholars as well. Briefly, Galenson's argument is that there are two very different styles of creativity, which he calls the experimental and the conceptual. Experimental artists spend a lifetime exploring the world as they perceive it, striving for a never fully formulated ideal toward which their actual works of art serve as so many cumulative attempts to capture some truth about the world worked out in the actual process of creating the artwork. Conceptual artists, by contrast, see the artwork as a realization of an innovative idea that is preformed, so that the work of creating the art really takes place before the actual execution, which itself consists of merely putting on canvas an already fully realized thought. Galenson argues that the experimental artist, generally speaking, has a career that involves a gradual evolution in which the finest works are produced last, when a lifetime of engaging with the medium and the world leads to deep masterworks. Therefore, these artists tend to be most creative later in life. Conceptual artists, by contrast, would be hampered by long immersion in the problems of the art history of the moment, since what they seek is a new idea. Instead, they brush aside convention and come at their work with a bold and innovative concept that, at its best, transforms the field. Typically, such artists accomplish their great work at an early age and often, either if they don't die young, if they do live long, rarely replicate their earliest dramatic conceptual breakthroughs. Galenson chooses as exemplars of these two styles of creativity Picasso and Cézanne, the former a great conceptual artist, the latter a great experimentalist. What is so novel about Galenson's approach is his method. He uses the tools of an economist to establish the relative greatness or creativity of an artist's oeuvre, and then correlates these with the ages at which the greatest accomplishments are achieved. By looking at such indicators as the relative prices at auction of paintings by the two painters when they were at different ages, the frequency with which paintings from their different artistic periods are reproduced in textbooks on the history of art, and the paintings chosen by museums for retrospective exhibits of the artist's work, Galenson creates a persuasive quantitative measure of when the artist's originality was at its peak. Remarkably, each of these measures produces exactly the same result. Picasso was at his greatest at age 26, when he broke with existing traditions and, working together with Braque and to some extent Gris, invented Cubism, which reoriented the entire subsequent history of art. Although he lived a long life, nothing he created later in life is rated by the collective judgment of those who buy, sell, write about, and curate art as equal to such early masterpieces as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, painted in 1907, when the artist was 26. By contrast, Cézanne's greatest work, judged by the same criteria and methods, are those, exactly all of them point to the same finding, are those from age 67, when he produced his most well-known and characteristic still lifes of apples, views of Mont Saint-Victoire, and so on. Unlike Picasso, Cézanne often did not sign his paintings, had little concern about marketing or selling them, and almost never considered them finished, instead viewing each one as a closer and closer approximation of a way of capturing perceived reality. In other words, as an experiment that emerged under his brush rather than as a theory or concept about the nature of perception, such as the Cubist idea. Before applying this theory to the academic career, I want to take a moment to appreciate the creativity of Galenson's own achievement. His work is a fine example of scholarly innovation at its best. No one before him had ever believed that the relative greatness of art could be turned into a quantitative measure. What was it that allowed him to make this novel discovery? As he himself says, it was that while he was writing a thesis on economics in college, he also took an elective course in the history of modern art, and for a term paper there, wondered whether there might be a way to evaluate art by looking at its market prices, recording in the ledgers of the great auction houses. He went on to do that study, turned out there was something to it, and he spent the rest of his life proving it. And if you read this wonderful book, he talks about not just Picasso and Cezanne, he goes through a number of great modern artists, and he then turns to writers, filmmakers, scientists, all kinds of people, and shows that the same pattern applies. This, that is, the fact that he was taking a course in art history and in writing a thesis in economics at the same time, is a fine illustration of the process that Arthur Koestler, in his rather neglected but nonetheless brilliant and masterful book, The Act of Creation, posits as the essence of creativity in both art and science, what he calls the bisociation of two hitherto incompatible matrices. When in reverie, dream, fantasy, imagination, or an inspired moment, a prepared mind juxtaposes one matrix or organized set of concepts and codes with another, the result can be a genuinely novel entity. Thus, in Galensen's case, the fact that he was studying art history at the same time as he was immersed in the field of economics created the favorable situation in which his mind was able to think the two very different fields together in a way that produced a scholarly breakthrough. There can be no stronger argument, I think, of the value of a liberal arts education, or indeed of a university that does not merely train students in a technique or an algorithm, but exposes them to a range of modes of thought so that some of them, at least, will unite in creative and productive ways what they have been taught. A recent sociological study of institutions that had nurtured the largest number of Nobel laureates and other high achievers in science and scholarship discovered that a key factor in each was that they encouraged people from different disciplines to come into regular contact with each other, underscoring the power of Koestler's key insight about creativity. At Caltech, for example, they have a weekly lunch at which you're required to sit next to somebody who's not in your department. And if I may go on to say so, one could say that the Emeritus College itself provides a foundation upon which just such an institution can and should be developed, since it does bring together in productive juxtaposition scholars who have devoted a lifetime to a field in an environment in which they can be exposed and stimulated by the thoughts and experiences of colleagues from other fields of study. And I wish you well on that project. I'll be joining you shortly. But to return to the question of creativity in the academic career, I believe it could probably be argued that most professors fall into the experimentalist style of creativity rather than the conceptual one in Galensen's terms. There are, of course, exceptions, and certain fields, such as mathematics, theoretical physics, and some others of the more formal sciences, are often characterized, perhaps unfairly, as ones in which the best work is often done early on. It's an old saw in administrative circles that in those fields it might make sense for, say, a brilliant mathematician to begin a career as a full professor, gradually devolve to being an associate professor, and end up as an assistant professor instead of the other way around. As an example, one can think of someone like James Watson, who was 25 when he discovered the structure of the double helix along with his colleague Francis Crick. Though he had a long scientific career, he never again came close to equaling that paradigm-altering achievement. But of course, how could he? Such discoveries only come along once in a century. Much the same, indeed, could be said about Einstein or Newton, both of whom made their great conceptual breakthroughs in their 20s and then spent long careers rife with achievement, like Picasso's, but without ever matching those earliest great contributions. By and large, however, it is my impression that most scholars in universities conform to the model of the old masters referred to in Galensen's title, who mature and deepen in their thinking and are sustained by an engagement with their subject matter that motivates them to keep experimenting and pushing further with problems that intrigue, provoke, and animate them, rather than reorienting the paradigm with one great conceptual coup and then waiting, usually in vain, for a comparable inspiration to strike again. If that is so, and while of course there is tremendous individual variation, it seems possible to propose that scholarly creativity in both teaching and research, and for those who choose it, administration, is something with the capacity to maintain itself and at best increase without break over the course of a scholar's career. So that answers the question of how long one can keep it up from the point of view of the motivation and ability of individual professors living out a career trajectory devoted to scholarly pursuits. But the answer to the question from an institutional and even legal point of view is, while far simpler, much more problematic. It is just this: as long as they please. In contemporary American universities, the combination of two factors, lifetime tenure and the absence of a mandatory retirement age, combine to produce a situation in which professors can remain on the job at full pay at will, and the institution has no power to do anything about it. With increases in longevity, in the extending of health and vigor in optimal cases into later and later ages, with improved health care and healthy lifestyles, and given that the work is of a sort that indeed benefits from a previous lifetime of experience and reward the ones who do it with great inner gratification, there is very little incentive for anyone to give it up unless moved to do so either by negative factors such as physical decline or positive ones such as a wish to spend unencumbered time pursuing avocations, enjoying family and friends, or enjoying life in the myriad ways in which it's possible to do that. Now, opinion is very much divided these days over the question of whether this current institutional arrangement in fact benefits the university, students, and the wider community, or whether it is in fact a privilege that really only serves the self-interest of the professoriate, which puts forward high-minded claims about the necessity of this system really as a smokescreen to protect a cushy sinecure enjoyed by almost no other sector of society. It is to this thorny question of academic tenure that I now want to turn my attention. Many of us may, in fact, take the question of tenure to be a settled issue, but it is not. In 1995, as I'm sure most of you know, the regents of the University of Minnesota attempted to put in place new regulations that included weakening the inviolability of tenured appointments, touching off what became known there as the Tenure Wars. In the end, tenure was retained. In the same year, the state legislature of South Carolina considered a bill to eliminate tenure from all state educational institutions, including the University of South Carolina, on the grounds that it was an inefficient business model. While the bill never made it out of committee, the fact that the suggestion was raised at all and provoked a stinging rebuttal from the head of the state's Commission on Higher Education shows that the matter is far from settled once and for all. Journal articles debating the merits or lack thereof of the tenure system are legion in educational circles. And I myself have heard fellow administrators opine, sometimes with distress, sometimes with eager anticipation, that the tenure system will probably be gone within the next few decades. We are all aware, I assume, of the hue and cry that has been raised against tenure for grade school teachers in the current ongoing battles over public employees unions, and the change in the popular stereotype of the school teacher in some sectors of the media, from benign, altruistic, underpaid nurturer of our children to overprivileged and underworked union thug, whose incompetence is protected by a lifetime guarantee of employment, has been swift and dramatic. I want to focus here on two recent books about the current state of higher education, both of which forthrightly call for the abolition of tenure for all university professors and for the end of the abolition, for the reinstatement of mandatory retirement. The authors of these books can be by no means dismissed as marginal cranks, nor are they apologists for either the corporate business model for universities stressing financial efficiency, nor are they apologists for a right-wing ideology that denounces university as hotbeds of tenured radicalism. Mark Taylor, author of Crisis on Campus, 2010, is a distinguished professor of religion and philosophy at Columbia with 24 books to his credit. The authors of Higher Education, 2010, by Andrew Hacker and his wife, Claudia Dreyfus, are respectively a distinguished professor of political science at Queens College, CUNY, and an adjunct faculty member at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and a regular contributor to the New York Times. But before addressing their critiques of tenure, leveled by these thoughtful observers, it will be useful to briefly sketch why tenure exists and what is its presumed rationale. As Taylor shows, the idea of the modern university was invented by none other than the great philosopher Immanuel Kant. in his 1798 treatise entitled The Conflict of Faculties. In that work, Kant distinguished between the professional faculties, which would train those such as lawyers, statesmen, and businessmen, who would, in effect, become servants of the state, and what he called the lower faculty, today's College of Liberal Arts, which would be free of all state interference, would study and teach knowledge solely for its own sake, would be able to sponsor thought critical of existing institutions, and would govern itself by peer review without fear of meddling by outside authorities. Kant's theoretical model was then implemented by the great educator Wilhelm von Humboldt at the University of Berlin, and the German Research University went on to become the model for the American Research University in the late 19th century, first with the establishment of Johns Hopkins, explicitly on the German model, followed by the founding or reorganization of universities such as the University of Chicago, Harvard under President Charles Eliot, and so on. And it continues to this day. Here at Emory, we have the same structure. The German university enshrined a principle called Lehrfreiheit, freedom to teach, that was the forerunner of today's tenure system in America, imported along with the rest of the Kantian Humboldtian model. It was recognized only informally, however, until the matter came to a head in the case of Edward Ross, an economics professor at Stanford, who in 1900 was fired for publicly espousing such then current but unpopular doctrines as free silver, a ban on immigration from China, municipal ownership of utilities, and the presidential candidacy of Williams Jennings Bryan. Perhaps his most fatal move was to argue against monopolies and in favor of close public scrutiny of the Southern Pacific Railroad, which was, of course, the source of the enormous wealth of Leland Stanford Sr., who had endowed the university in the first place. Stanford's widow, Jane Lothrop Stanford, who was the university's sole trustee at the time, insisted that Ross be dismissed, and the president, David Starr Jordan, after whom Jordan Hall, which I'm sure many of you have visited, complied. This provoked several of Ross's faculty colleagues to leave Stanford in protest and themselves become embroiled in similar disputes elsewhere. One, William Fisher, for example, was fired from Wesleyan in 1913 for supporting relaxation of the Sabbath and stressing the importance of good works over church attendance. That same year, another refugee from Stanford, Arthur Lovejoy, then at Johns Hopkins, rallied several colleagues to form a national association of professors to protect the principle of Lehrfreiheit. 2 years later, in 1915, the American Association of University Professors came into existence and issued the 1915 Declaration of Principles, identifying three distinct elements within the overall rubric of academic freedom. These were, and I quote, freedom of inquiry and research, freedom of teaching within the college and university, and freedom of extramural utterance and action. In 1940, after the American Association of Colleges weakened some aspects of the 1915 Declaration, a new agreement was reached which established the principle of the probationary pre-tenure employment period and made all dismissals for cause, and subject to a trial procedure in which faculty peers would be deciding votes. The 1940 Declaration is the basis of all tenure practices in American universities today. The cause for which you can be dismissed usually are very limited to either failure to perform your duties, moral turpitude, or, I must say, being a dean, having read the fine print, any other cause. Very seldom exercised. As Gregory Dickinson, in his excellent brief history of the tenure system, points out, the effectiveness of the Declaration came about in part because it was seen as part of a much larger unionization movement during the early years of the 20th century that sought to erect all sorts of protections of employees of all kinds against exploitation and peremptory or arbitrary dismissal by employers. That it was in effect the formation of a teachers' union. Although the Supreme Court decided in 1980 in the National Labor Relations Board versus Yeshiva decision that college faculty members were management, not workers, and therefore could not form unions, The moral force of the AAUP, together with the fact that any university that on its own chose to do away with tenure would not only receive heavy criticism, but would lose market position in the perpetual chase after the best and brightest professors, have served to maintain the real teeth in the guarantees of job security afforded by the tenure system. In the 1940 Declaration, two different rationales for tenure are enunciated. One is that without tenure, the academic profession will not be able to attract men and women of the best quality and thus optimally serve its students and society. This was a key argument made, for instance, by David Loop, the head of the South Carolina Commission on Education, in opposing the proposed 1995 bill to abolish tenure there. South Carolina, he showed, would lose competitive advantage in attracting strong scholars, and the result would be a decline in research income for the state. So this was basically a financial argument. This argument for tenure, along with the self-protection dimension embodied in the union-like positions defending job security, may be thought of as the less high-minded, if also perfectly reasonable, defenses of tenure. There is also, however, the more noble and idealistic rationale for tenure stated in the 1940 Declaration in these words, quote, freedom of teaching and research and of extramural activities. According to this rationale, tenure protects not only the professors themselves and the competitiveness of the institution, not to mention the economic advantage of the community, but also of society at large. From what then does tenure for professors actually, or in theory, protect society? This is where the critiques of the tenure system, such as those leveled by Taylor and Hacker and Dreyfus, are at their most cutting. Taylor, for example, in addition to arguing that tenure is simply a perk unfairly enjoyed by only this one sector of the employed population, and that it is economically inefficient since it requires universities to spend large amounts on the high salaries of senior professors when they could be hiring less expensive junior professors, takes on the academic freedom argument with these words, quote, the traditional defense of tenure is academic freedom. In the absence of tenure, the argument goes, professors would not be free to express controversial ideas, new ideas that question conventional wisdom without fear of dismissal. But on the basis of my experience, this argument is completely without merit. In 40 years of teaching, I cannot think of a single person who was more willing to express his or her views after tenure than before, unquote. Other critics have gone farther and argued that in the pre-tenure period, junior faculty members must actually get into the habit of not crossing their tenured colleagues by stating unconventional ideas, so these colleagues will support them during their tenure review. Thus, it is claimed tenure actually discourages rather than encourages real originality. Likewise, it is often argued that tenure actually serves to lessen the incentive of those who hold it to be productive, to be less productive as they would be if they had to pass a regular review of their work in order to hang on to their jobs. Hacker and Dreyfus, for their part, after reassuring us readers that, of course, they favor untrammeled inquiry and the unfettered pursuit of truth, write that such claims as that tenure exists, as a New Jersey Superior Court ruling put it, quote, out of concern for the general welfare by providing the benefits of uninhibited scholarship and its free dissemination, though they have a plausible ring, I'm quoting now Hacker and Dreyfus, do not themselves show why this desirable result can be ensured only by the protection of employment for the professoriate. Like Taylor, they write that, quote, we have scoured all the sources we could find, including the ACLU and the AAUP, and yet could not find any academic research whose findings led to terminating the jobs of faculty members. We're referring to research that chemistry professors do in chemistry, geologists do in geology, and English professors do in literature. By this last caveat, which is central to their argument, they are ruling out cases in which professors are dismissed for expressing unpopular opinions not related to their field of inquiry. This is a whole huge issue, which I don't have time to delve into. I have very strong feelings about it. If you want to, we can discuss it later. And they go on to list 3 such cases. A professor at an Alabama college who blamed the president of the college for falling enrollment and poor morale in a local newspaper article. A professor at a Baptist university in Ohio for failing, quote, to maintain consistent, biblically appropriate spiritual interest and effective Christian relations within the university family. And an engineering professor in Idaho who sought a no-confidence vote in his president. These authors then conclude that three features of these three cases stand out. First, they all lost their jobs. Two, the tenure didn't actually protect them. And three, the acts of speech that got them in trouble did not involve their actual teaching or research in their academic specialties. You could question that in the case of the Baptist teacher. I don't know what he was a professor of, but it sounded like one could make that argument. Since anyone in any profession might get into trouble for criticizing a superior or failing to abide by principles espoused by the employing institution, Hacker and Dreyfus argue that, quote, "It is quite a stretch to say that because being a professor is their occupation, everything they do must become an exercise of academic freedom. Criticism of a supervisor doesn't take on any special status because it is leveled at the head of a college rather than, say, the head of an insurance company. We would only add that there are another 300 million residents of this country who would very much like to express themselves without hindrance or penalties. We hope it won't be argued that professors need broader and more vigorous protections for speech in and out of their workplace than accountants or dentists," unquote. Like Taylor, they suggest that professors can and should defend their right to speech on the basis of the First Amendment, like everyone else, not on the basis of some special dispensation granted to no one else except federal judges. Both Taylor and Hacker and Dreyfus argue that to deal with 21st century challenges, including globalization, the ongoing revolution in communications technology, the non-viability of most university business models in the current and foreseeable financial climate, the mobility of the workforce, new and less linear patterns of life and work for younger generations, and other considerations, the university must be nimble, and the tenure creates a kind of sclerosis that prevents the infusion of new blood and a quick response to new ideas and circumstances. Since, so they claim, the arguments for tenures are either bogus, in the case of the argument about freedom of academic teaching and inquiry, or merely self-serving and unfair to the millions who do not enjoy tenure protection, there is therefore no reason other than stodginess and self-interest, both at the level of the individual and the university, that's where the stodginess and self-interest is, to retain this tenure system. And they both also go on to call for the elimination of unrestricted employment. That is, they argue in favor of mandatory retirement at age 70. It should be, they argue, replaced with contract appointments leading to periodic review, which would both ensure a higher level of post-tenure performance and/or weed out those who are no longer performing up to standards. These arguments deserve serious consideration, and indeed, they sound very plausible. And I will admit, as a dean, I have had my moments of wishing tenure weren't there. But in my view, they are profoundly wrong for a number of reasons. The first group of these are internal to their arguments. The second group of concerns are graver. They have to do with what I perceive as the public good that the research of tenured faculties at research universities provide, and the sustained threat that it is under in the contemporary political arena. To begin with Taylor's assertion that in his 40 years he has never encountered anyone who was more outspoken after tenure than before, I can do no better than to quote Taylor's colleague Jonathan Cole, the longtime provost of Columbia. Cole writes, quote, "I don't know where Mark was hanging out over those 40 years, but he surely was not considering the repression that has periodically taken place at our great universities. These episodes include the McCarthy era, when only tenure prevented many professors from being fired, and many untenured professors were in fact let go, and some tenured people too. The civil rights era, when faculty members risked dismissal for favoring integration in some parts of this country. Or the anti-Vietnam War era, when administrators, such as even the redoubtable Henry Rosofsky, as he admits in his memoir, the famous dean of Harvard, were sorely tempted to try to fire professors who aided and abetted student protesters. Rosofsky writes in his book that while he was sorely tempted to do it at the time, later in his reflection, he's glad that tenure was there and he couldn't, even though he tried. In any event, Taylor's personal opinion about his colleagues' attitudes hardly constitutes anything resembling a real argument. The arguments of Hacker and Dreyfus are more numerous but easier to refute, being rather like the arguments put forth in Freud's famous case of the person who returned a borrowed pot in a damaged condition, arguing that A, he had never borrowed it, B, it was already damaged when he borrowed it, and C, it was in fine condition when he returned it. Hacker and Dreyfus argue that in all their travels, they never met anyone who was dismissed for unpopular views, that they encountered several people who were dismissed for their unpopular views, so tenure is not so great after all, that no one with tenure is ever dismissed anyway, and that at places like Evergreen College and others where there is no tenure, no one is ever dismissed either. But of course, they didn't come across anyone who was fired because they were not able to be fired, precisely because tenure was in place. If it hadn't been, quite a few of them surely would have been fired. Their argument that being fired for problematic speech outside one's field of study doesn't count is inconsistent with both the 1915 and the 1940 Declaration, according to which extramural speech and activity is as protected as is speech or activity in the classroom or in research publication. And we know very often that one is the excuse for hiring somebody in the other area. In my view, the opposite is the case. Professors who do good academic work but hold extramural views at odds with prevailing norms or opinions are especially in need of the defense of tenure, as for example the case of Ward Churchill versus the University of Colorado, which is still unresolved as we speak, amply demonstrates. I could spend several hours on the Churchill case, but I won't. If you want to ask me about it, I'll wax eloquent. In any event, both books are altogether too sanguine about what is at stake in the debate over tenure and academic freedom. So let me be clear. The public good that research universities provide for society is the discovery and dissemination of statements about the world in the most general sense that have been arrived at by methods and in a spirit untainted by any sort of external interest, bias, or pressure, and are recognized as such by the community of scholarly peers who are the only ones capable of making such a judgment. Protected by the often derided ivy-covered walls of the campus from the direct impact of the forces of the market, the work conducted in universities, especially by researchers, is guided by a prestige economy as opposed to a monetary one, and in this respect stands apart from most other contemporary institutions. Professors are motivated not by the hope of financial reward alone. Obviously, people want to be well paid, they want raises and so on, but that's not what they're mainly motivated by. If they were, they would never have gone to graduate school. But by a commitment to research that meets the canons of their discipline and for which they are recognized and rewarded, not necessarily with monetary rewards, but with honors, which is why I say it's a prestige economy. Society desperately needs access to unbiased and disinterested facts upon which to make key decisions about all sorts of policy at every level. Is the climate warming or isn't it? Is the deficit going to get worse or not? We have to know the answer to these kinds of questions. If facts are reduced to manipulable items in a larger game of economic interest or political power, then any basis for rational decision making is rendered hopeless. That is why research integrity is, in my opinion, the highest value that a faculty can hold. And why, in fact, when people are dismissed, in my experience, it's for violations of research integrity. That's the crime of crimes among academics. Yet the forces imperiling such unfettered inquiry are many and relentless. Donors, funding agencies, outside interest groups of many various kinds from all over the political spectrum all have agendas to which they attempt to tie their support or their lack of it for universities. It does not matter what their agendas are, but rather that it is rarer and rarer, for example, in my experience, for a philanthropist to give a large sum of money to a university and say, "You're the best judge of what to do with it." And here let me acknowledge with deep gratitude as one counterexample, one gift to Emory College recently made in the bequest of the alum, the late James Varner, which was in fact unencumbered with any restriction. But more and more donors want to have a very clear sense of what they want and are willing to either withhold their funds if you don't get it or give you a hard time. These forces have of course always been there, though they are growing steadily in power and influence. What is of greater concern, however, is the fact that powerful interest groups are targeting the very idea of disinterested knowledge altogether. We thus have the spectacle, for example, of large numbers of members of Congress asserting that the science indicating man-made global warming is false or not proven. I am not asserting, of course, that I know the answer to whether global warming is occurring and is caused by human activity, but since I, the dean of a major research university, don't know this, I'm fairly certain that these Congress people don't know either, and nevertheless are attacking the hitherto widely supported legitimacy of the scientific community and the scientific method itself in what is very obviously the self-interest of well-funded corporations and individuals who profit from the production of fuels that emit greenhouse gases and who donate generously to the election campaigns of these same legislators. We also see the establishment and growth in legitimacy in the public eye of privately funded think tanks that produce research not guided by the principles that guide university research, but by the economic and political agendas of their founders. And in the mass media, we see the conflation of these two as if they stood on equal terms. We see the growth of for-profit educational institutions guided not by any ethical concern, but only by the bottom line. We see a congressional climate in which cutting funds not only for the perpetual targets, the NEA and the NEH, but also NIH and NSF are on the agenda. We see a U.S. senator, somewhat like Proxmire before him, grabbing headlines by very selectively investigating the use of federal research dollars by university researchers, more in the interest of grabbing headlines than of creating good research. And most chillingly, to me, we see a very troubling new development, namely the realization on the part of some politicians that professors at state universities are in fact state employees like any other, and can therefore be placed under scrutiny for their strict adherence to rules guiding the conduct of such state employees in everything from the integrity of their research to their public taking of partisan positions to their use of their computers to let their spouse know they will be home late for dinner rather than for scholarly research. Consider the fact that the Attorney General of Virginia is currently investigating possible research fraud by a climate scientist at UVA, or the state Senate in Wisconsin demanding the email files of a very distinguished U.S. historian who had the temerity to write a historically true account on the op-ed pages of the Times of the role of Wisconsin Republicans in labor disputes in the past. There was a very positive article about the past record of Wisconsin Republicans in this kind of thing. I doubt whether these professors will lose their jobs, but that is actually not the point. The University of Chicago's great president, Robert Hutchins, who unlike the presidents of other universities in the McCarthy era, refused to be badgered into turning on his faculty, pointed out the obvious, quote, "The question is not how many professors are fired for their beliefs, but how many think they might be. The entire teaching profession is intimidated," unquote. And if the teaching profession is intimidated, who will be our truth tellers? I believe universities must vigorously recommit to support the principles of tenure as a guarantor of research integrity, which is, as I've said, the highest value we as scholars hold. I believe this not in spite of the criticisms leveled at the tenure system or without recognition that they are very convincing, but precisely because they are so reasonable, appealing, and convincing. And as I said, I'm sure I'm not the only academic administrator, or Rosofsky either, who in the late hours of the night has not gnashed his or her teeth and thought, how can I get past this? As Hacker and Dreyfus admit, quote, "We realize that to question tenure puts us in strange company. Most who oppose it are executives who abhor employment guarantees of any kind, or conservatives who view it as the enabler of left-wing correctness on campuses," unquote. They are quite right. The past several decades have witnessed a concerted attempt by moneyed interests in corporations, controlling outsized resources, to eliminate or devalue or otherwise weaken any institution that stands in the way of unregulated, unopposed, unfettered, profit-driven business activity. I am as strongly in support as anyone else of strong business enterprise necessary for production, consumption, and employment in a vibrant economy. But I, like many others, am taken aback at the vehemence and surprising political success of efforts all to undermine, delegitimize, or destroy institutions that do not simply support the economic interests of large-scale businesses at the expense of employees, not to mention the environment, and for good measure, the search for knowledge based on disinterested research free of external interference. These institutions, as Chris Hedges argues, that is the ones that stand in the way of unfettered free market, include labor unions, independent media, mainstream churches, and religious institutions, and the Democratic Party, and universities, a list to which we might now add the federal government itself. We are witnessing in today's headlines the climax of the effort to destroy unions. We know that the vast majority of media outlets are in no position to question or critique corporate power, since they themselves are owned by and agents of it. We have seen public religious discourse usurped by a particular ideology that glorifies wealth and subjects the traditional religious concerns of the mainstream denominations of altruism, service, concern for the less fortunate, and anything that can be labeled social justice to mockery and contempt. We have watched the feckless pandering of the Democratic Party and its inability to articulate a clear vision to counter an extreme Ayn Randian ideology, all the while collecting corporate backing from the same corporate donors that support both parties. And we may well be on the verge of witnessing a deadlock in the federal government that will literally bring it to a grinding halt. The last one standing, in short, is the university, and calls for the abolition of tenure, no matter how sensible they may sound or no matter whom they issue from, are, in these circumstances, nothing other than stalking horses, intentional or not, for a much less high-minded assault that would delegitimize, for the blatantly self-interested purposes of a small but disproportionately well-funded and highly motivated minority of the community, the research integrity and the spirit of open critique in the last bastion within which they are still reasonably well protected. Scholarly creativity in later life can be, and usually is, the rich culmination of a lifetime of experiment and experience on the part of individuals who, whatever their faults, and they have many, it is true, like everyone else, are driven by the pursuit of knowledge that stands the test of the judgment of the scholarly community. It should be supported for that reason alone. But the safeguards that protect such scholars from being intimidated or made to pull their punches or hold their fire, these two need, now more than ever, to be reaffirmed in the scholarly community and by the society that benefits from having genuine truth-tellers in its midst. Thank you. I gather it's traditional to entertain questions, so I'll be happy to take your comments or questions. Yes?
Yeah, I have 3 quick points. Number 1, as a physician who came here in 1964, got tenure in 67 after being an assistant professor. And academic freedom was very important in a time when Emory was not very liberal in many areas, including racial relations. And similarly, in the 80s, when I and others were trying to put AIDS in the face of Emory and had a lot of problems. So academic freedom was particularly valuable. Just to point out that for MDs, at least in my days now, there are many PhDs in the medical school where tenure is much more important, because in those days and even now, you can go out in practice and make more than you would in academics, at least in the junior ranks. Secondly was the importance that you didn't mention of sabbaticals. And I know it's a tangent, but I think it's a very, very important for particularly tenured professors, because the young don't have the opportunity of going on sabbatical like Australians, who go and pollinate all over the world and are very creative in their science. And thirdly is the possibility that we use to get the kind of professor that's still very active in Europe at the age of 65, 67 has to retire. I would bring them over here, pay very limited amounts. They would spend several months teaching and researching. And I proposed this to Jim Wagner a few years ago. I think that's an excellent way to get really world-class people to come to Emory at very cheap. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Certainly it's the case that Emory itself has a history about, in which there were unpopular opinions expressed in a climate that was different from what it is today. But we can take nothing for granted. I agree. Sabbatical, I'm on sabbatical, and it's greatest champion right at the moment. It's a great institution. And it is true that Hacker and Dreyfus and Taylor both called for the elimination of sabbatical leave. And say, if you want to write books, you have all summer, what's the problem? So that's the case. And thirdly, we do, in fact, have taken advantage of that. For example, just to give one example, David Eltis, very distinguished Woodruff professor of history here, who has made the news many times because of his incredible this web project he has recording the history of slave voyages from Africa to America and documenting these. He's here because he was in a Canadian university and was forced to retire at 65 and has done his great work here, so we've benefited from that. But we have several examples. I could name right off the top of my head at least 4 people who we got because they were forced to retire elsewhere. So that's a good suggestion.
Get into a different field quickly by either the sabbatical or having world experts in a particular area you're not particularly knowledgeable.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for a very eloquent and scholarly lecture. Very convincing. But I wonder how you, if you don't mind, how you personally feel about tenure for teachers at the elementary, high school level, where they are teaching more or less by protocol or by defined curriculum, as opposed to establishing and developing new knowledge.
Well, that's obvious. I assumed I would get asked that question. And I was trying to think of a way to avoid answering it. But the answer is I do not have the same uninhibited enthusiasm for tenure for grade school teachers or high school teachers that I have for university professors, for the simple reason that it's usually given for a length of service rather than as the result of a very, very rigorous review of research and teaching. It's usually not a demarcation of excellence of any kind, whereas the tenure review does, in fact, in my opinion, certify excellence. What opened my eyes more than anything else in being an academic administrator, both as dean and as head of the T&P committee, was just how incredibly good the quality of our faculty is, and also how rigorous and how fair the review process really is, how seriously it's taken. I've just been very impressed with that. When I recently spoke with Robin Foreman, the new dean who succeeded me in the College of Arts and Sciences, he had just finished going through the whole promotion process for the spring, and he couldn't stop raving about how he had no idea we had such a distinguished faculty. And unless you see the whole range of these CVs, you just don't have any idea. Nothing like that occurs in schools that gives tenure. It was put in place back in the day when university tenure was established as sort of a thought that, well, all teachers should have this. But while I can see both sides of this, and to some extent I feel that both about the teachers' unions and about their opponents, that my real view is a plague on both their houses. But all in all, I don't think that tenure for school teachers is in the same category as tenure for university professors. That's my honest opinion.
Well,
Follow up?
well, we're going to have a question I have another one. And that is, one of the things that plague many young faculty is they put forth effort in teaching And yet, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of their teaching? And I'm talking particularly about those that have to deliver lectures to classes, large classes. I'm not talking about somebody who mentors a graduate student.
One of the accomplishments of which I'm most proud in my many years of service to Emory is that as chair of the Committee on Tenure and Promotion, I made it a policy that excellence in teaching had to count equally with excellence in research. That's very rare. Most colleges, if they give lip service to that idea, they don't do it in practice. That in most places, tenure is based on research, and if you're an okay teacher, fine. You know, you really have to be pretty bad not to do it. However, the question is not so easy. You can't send letters out to outside people and say, well, you know, how good is their teaching, because how should they know? Whereas you can do that with their research. But at Emory, George Jones, who was professor of chemistry and also dean of the graduate school, chaired a committee that put together a very, very elaborate and rigorous set of criteria for judging teaching at Emory, one that I think is not equaled by any other school. And that includes not only a student evaluation of teachers, which, by the way, in my experience, is far more accurate than people think it is, even the students. The students really think, oh, this, you know, I'm just filling this thing out. But if you compare what they say with your own impression of how good these teachers are, plus the scuttlebutt about them and every other criteria, it turns out there's a very strong correlation between what teachers that students like and the ones who you think are good teachers. And it's not simply because they give easy grades. I mean, that really is not the case. But they're also required to put in all of their syllabi, their tests. They're required to be visited by senior professors in their department who sit in on their lectures and grade them on their lectures, give them feedback, and if they are inadequate or could use improvement, are required to undergo some kind of teacher training through the various centers for teacher training that exist on the campus. In short, the handbook that George Jones helped put together and that we have lived by for these years, I think does about as good a job of evaluating teaching as it's possible to do without being really intrusive. One also collects letters from former students and all kinds of things, and if there are complaints, one listens to those as well. So while it's less systematic than the judging of research, it certainly can be done at a very high level. And my belief is that we not only do it, but we reward it here. And in fact, there are plenty of people who have received tenure primarily on the basis of really outstanding teaching, as long as their research is also in the very good category. And we also have in the college an institution that anyone who has served as an outstanding teacher for a very long period of time without receiving a promotion because they've chosen not to pursue a research career can nonetheless be promoted to a professorial rank. Similarly, we just instituted 2 years ago, the possibility that senior lecturers who demonstrated excellence in teaching could be promoted to the rank of professor of practice or professor of performance, depending on what their field is. So we do, I think Emory is unique among the great research institutions, at least the college is, in that it really does place as high an emphasis on undergraduate teaching as it does on research. John.
It's a small step from your concern about university tenure. It's a small step from your concern about university tenure and its preservation to the tenured federal and state employees in this country, whom reportedly are paid at a 13 to 30% higher rate than the average employee in this country, has essentially lifelong tenure, a great retirement program, health benefits, and everything else that far exceed the average employee in the country. And I think that is also a huge concern.
It's certainly a very great concern, and we see it being played out in the politics of the day, absolutely. Once again, I would make a similar response to the one I made about teachers, which is that my argument for tenure relied on the importance of research integrity. I think that's not something that applies to anything outside a research university, frankly. That research integrity is the value that a society gets from its investment in universities. The question of whether it's fair that public employees, or even whether it's even the case, which I gather can be argued many ways, that they benefit excessively or more than others. You know, some people would argue, well, they shouldn't get all that when other people don't. Other people would argue, well, if they get it, everybody else should too. That's a separate issue. I'm not going to weigh in on those political issues of state and federal unions, which is a very thorny issue. But as I said, to me, the key distinction is the same one that separates college teachers from high school teachers. Not only that it's not based on length of service, which is usually the seniority, which is usually the case with state and federal employees, but that it is there in order to protect the research integrity of knowledge that's produced by the society, and that everybody in the society, whatever their political position, needs in order to make sound judgments.
Are there ways in which universities could be more creative? Thinking of this very fascinating parallel with the study of the artist and creativity may be coming to its fullness in the late 50s and 60s perhaps, that universities could be more creative in treating older faculty and recognizing that this perhaps is not the same as being a early faculty member, and doing much more in the way of, for example, suggesting lower salaries for part-time work, which would free up money to hire junior faculty at the same time. It strikes me that we're often caught into a very wooden pattern here, and senior professors pay keeps going up and up. In fact, you start drawing Social Security in this country at a certain time, which would compensate for lower salaries. And other creative ways too of making sure that you're just not keeping dead wood. I mean, I just wonder what room there is for creativity, whether you've come across any possible patterns for this.
The first thing I'd say is that yes, there is the risk of accumulating dead wood when you have tenure and no mandatory retirement. But I will reiterate that in my experience, the number of people who have really just settled back and done nothing after they've gotten tenure can be counted on the fingers of one hand. I mean, this is not a huge problem, and it's a very small price to pay. It is, however, true that people's interests differ. That is, they may want to shift their emphasis from writing or researching to teaching, or even to administration. And I think that the university should be flexible and should be able to allow people at different points. So I would certainly value periodic review of people during their tenured period, not for the purpose of kicking them out, but for the purpose of saying, are you leading the most productive life you can in this university, given who you are, where your thoughts are. The university, Middlebury College has a program where at a certain age, it may be 65, I'm not sure what it is, you can opt to become what they call, I think, a faculty associate, which means that you receive 3/5 of your salary and you teach a slightly lowered teaching load. And you can keep doing that and you don't have to serve on any committees. So that's an example of precisely the kind of thing that you're talking about. And people, I think we should probably explore more ways for people who want to, as they become older, to think about different varieties of ways of integrating their life. I think, for example, of the fact that if you are a laboratory scientist, you have to really believe or act on the idea that you have to stop accepting graduate students under you about 5 years before you plan to retire. Because otherwise, if they're going to come to work with you when you retire, that's not fair to the student. So there's this 5-year period when you're a senior professor of some laboratory science and you're not teaching graduate students, which is where a bunch of the emphasis of their work is. Well, should these people teach more undergraduate courses, or should there be another way that they can organize their lives? I do think that the university needs to be far more creative. I do, however, believe that it needs to be within the respect for the institution of tenure rather than involve any diminution of it. Yes.
I'm just a wife, not a faculty member.
No
And
such thing as
I
just
just
a
wonder what
wife.
happens if you keep on all the retired, I mean, I love this idea of gradual diminishing and of accepting the life of retirement, because it's quite a shock if it comes all at once. But there also has to be room for younger faculty people coming in to keep the university alive. And it has struck me that at the last graduation to which my husband, the last graduation he attended, there was absolutely no one from the history department there. All the younger faculty members are so busy being on committees, doing their research, their teaching, and trying to have families, that the pressures on them are tremendous. And I'm a New Yorker. I mean, I'm used to pressure being part of life, but I just wonder if the humanness of the university, of the whole, that's something that I think needs to be taken into consideration, but it's wonderful to have rigor.
Thank you. The concern that people preparing for a tenure review are in a high state of anxiety and stress and have miserable experience is true, has always been true, and would certainly not be lessened if we didn't have tenure. That is, if you had to be reviewed every 7 years, you would have the same experience, 5 or 6 times over rather than just having it once. So, though both Taylor and Hacker and Dreyfus make that suggestion, I think it's complete hooey. That to say, well, these people suffer so much from having to be subjected to this tenure review. Yeah, right. I mean, it's not pleasant, but
I'm not saying
much
it
of it.
shouldn't be
No,
tenure review at all.
I'm agreeing with your point that it is very hard on people, and it's especially hard, if I may say so, on women who are at their peak reproductive years just when this is all supposed to be happening. And so it's been one of my main concerns, and I've never been able to really figure out what to do about it, how to adjust the tenure cycle to a woman's life trajectory, which is not necessarily, I mean, fathers play important roles obviously too, but they are not in fact pregnant and so on. So I mean, you can see all the problems that are there, and I didn't get into this, but it is a sad fact that while about 50% of our assistant professors at this point are women, the percentage goes way down when you reach the full professor level. And why that is, I don't know. And a very high number of those full professors are women, who are either not married, never married, or don't have children. So I think we really need to think about how tenure is all managed. And I also certainly think that we do need to provide ways for people to step down gradually. But I don't think that placing limits on people, even though it has costs, I think the benefits are worth it.
I fear that on this wonderfully provocative issue, but we've nevertheless run out of time, and even in the very practical sense of the rental of the space. And so I have to ask that we call this to a close, that we have a few moments to express our gratitude to Sally Paul is wonderfully fertile and imaginative, creative.
The challenges of the theme of creativity came home to me when I was thinking about a creative way to say thank you. And I called in some assistants from John Gunmen and Herb Benario and others. And please accept this gift from the Emeritus College as an expression of our gratitude for your presentation today. And we hope it'll give you some hours of listening pleasure.
Oh, okay, well, that's a good hint. Thank you very much. This was certainly not necessary, but the gratification of addressing you was a pleasure, but certainly much appreciated. And once again, thanks to you and John, to Madhu and Jag, and to all of you for participating. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.